Welcome to Make It Make Sense. We are Marlene and Paulina, two research assistants at the Obama Institute for Transnational American Studies at JGU Mainz.
In this podcast, we take you on a deep dive into the world of our study program. Together with guests from all throughout the discipline, we talk about everyday societal topics you might not have guessed are connected to our field.
Join us in making sense of the issues that surround us and, most importantly, have fun listening. Welcome back to Make It Make Sense. It's good being back behind the mic again.
Yeah, and saddle up, everyone, because today we're diving into one of the most enduring myths in American history, the Wild West.
I think when you hear the term Wild West, the same kind of image pops into everyone's minds, which is like cowboys, outlaws, saloons. I don't know, ghost towns, gunslingers, right? All of that. But how much of that is actually real?
That's what we're trying to find out today. And for that, we have someone very special with us today, the Obama Institute's very own Dr. Torsten Kathke. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Hi. I don't believe in ghosts, but ghost towns are very real.
That's already the first myth. No, but what we here on Make It Make Sense like to do is that our guests kind of introduce themselves. So we're just going to immediately hand it back over to you.
Exactly. It would be awesome if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your research. And as we said, today's episode is about the myth of the Wild West, and you've done some work related to that, right?
Yeah, I have in many different ways. My name is Torsten Kathke. I am a historian of the United States and North America more generally in the 19th and 20th century. And I'm in my current project also looking at Europe and the transatlantic world. But the Wild West is what I wrote my first book about, not the Wild West as a myth, but the place in which the Wild West is often located. I looked at the American Southwest and especially at Arizona and New Mexico. And the book is called Wires That Bind, and it talks about the very different people who showed up there and the ways in which they were integrated into the American nation in the 19th century, which is the time that the quote-unquote Wild West happens.
Yeah.
That's awesome that it's so on topic for us. And what we also like to do here is to look at an example from pop culture that kind of helps us dive into the topic. Now, I think when it comes to the Wild West, there are like a lot of things that first come to my mind.
Yeah, I think it's a really popular setting. I mean, Westworld on HBO, for example, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Red Dead Redemption, that's a video game. Borderlands, just to throw out a couple of them. And all of them depict this world of lawless frontiers and endless desert landscape. And I think that very much shapes national and even global narratives for us, right? Like getting that image through the media.
And today we kind of hope to separate fact from fiction a little bit and show you guys why all of this still matters, of course, with the help of Torsten Kathke. But before, do you maybe have a favorite narrative before we dive into the topic?
About the American West?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you seen any of the shows?
Other than your amazing book, of course.
Have you played Red Dead Redemption?
I have not. I think the most American West video game I played ages ago was Oregon Trail, and you just kept dying of, I think, dysentery.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
I've just read a book about that video game.
Yeah, video games, important. Not dying of preventable diseases, also important. The American West, to me, is kind of not just the place, right, and not just the media, but also the idea of the West transported into different places and kind of in the consciousness of the United States generally. So some of my favorite things that have to do with the American West aren't specifically set in the American West themselves. I once joked that my favorite movie, my favorite Western movie was Back to the Future 3 because it it very much is a commentary on Western movies, right? It's kind of it's a time travel story, and it looks at the American West through the lens of somebody who is from our time, or almost our time now.
Yeah.
It's been a while. And the idea of the American West also is found in a whole lot of other things. My favorite example for a future American West is Star Trek, which is specifically patterned after the Western TV shows of the 1950s and 1960s, and was sold as one of those Western TV shows, but in space. And if you've seen that once, you can't unsee it. You just look at it, and you find the story elements, you find the structures, you find all of that. But as far as my favorite Western, it's I think I'm going to say Stagecoach is the John Ford Western. That's the American Western. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is really kind of that European take on the American Western, is really quite a classic.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, definitely. So to get a little deeper into it, let's perhaps start at the beginning, right? So when people talk about the Wild West, quote unquote, what are they actually talking about? I mean, we mentioned these images that come to mind, but how did all of this come to be? Like, where did this idea of the Wild West, the way we see it in the media, come from?
I think it's important to note that the idea of the Wild West or the Old West is itself a media idea of an actually existing place that was romanticized even at the time that the Wild West was ongoing. So it's always a little bit tricky to say when is the Wild West or when is the Old West. I think the most typical time frame, and I think the time frame that most of the movies are set in that you would call Westerns, is from the 1860s to maybe the 1880s, maybe the 1890s. It kind of differs a little bit depending on where you are in the United States and who you focus on. But it is, I think, importantly, a idea that really comes to the fore after the Civil War. The Civil War ends in the mid-1860s, and all of a sudden there's a lot of young men who are soldiers who are suddenly no longer soldiers, who have to do something and have to try and make it on their own in some kind of fashion. And they go to the West, and it becomes this whole cultural thing of go West, and that's where you should be. There is also obviously a West before that. The United States kind of has always had a West. The moment you land on the East Coast, everything else is West.
Yeah.
And you see some of the tropes that we find in Western stories today emerge relatively early on in settings that aren't what we would today call the American West, right? Wyoming or Arizona or even California. If you think about the leather stocking tales, for example, you have a West that is much farther east than the Wild West of the 1870s. 1870s, I think, is really kind of the best decade to look at for that.
And I want to kind of pick up on what you said kind of in the beginning, which is that in that sense, the myth actually also started as entertainment, right?
Yeah, the myth is entertainment in, if you think about the 19th century and what is entertainment in the 19th century, it's novels are big, books, stories are a big thing. And what you also have is traveling shows, and you have the kind of the storylines of the Westerns coming out of Western stories and Western novels, and the myths kind of grow up with them, and the typical tropes of American Westerns start emerging. If you look at something like Owen Wister, and then you also have, since this is ongoing and there are kind of larger than life characters who are very good at presenting themselves as if they are actual Western heroes, they exist, they talk about their exploits, And whether that's true or not, it's a good story, and people tend to prefer a good story to the actual truth. So a lot of that just kind of becomes true in people's minds. And the idea of entertainment really comes in with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It's such a popular piece of entertainment, basically kind of a circus show in which, quote unquote, real Western heroes are also part of it, right? They would have real former Westerners, or actually Westerners who supposedly had done something great. You would have real indigenous Americans who decided after they've lost the last of the Indian Wars that they had to live somewhere and had to do something, and they actually become part of these shows. So the mixture of the idea of the West and the actual West it's kind of hard, because if you are an actual person who lived there and who can say, yes, I was there in the mythical American West, and then you make your living as part of an entertainment show about the mythical American West, it really becomes kind of hard to
just to
put
differentiate
anything in.
between the two, right?
It's really hard to tell that apart.
Yeah. The line gets really blurry at one point.
Absolutely. And with that bigger than life characters, there's also always this aspect of nation building, right?
Yeah, nation building. This is why it's the American West, right? The Wild West, the American West is really about American nation building. So I think the way that we also need to understand this is in the sense of kind of the modern nation forming in the latter half of the 19th century, and the United States becoming more assertive, becoming more of a larger power. More people are in the United States. They keep adding territory by conquering territory in the West. The formerly Mexican territory in the West is a big part of the American Western myth. And they're starting to tell themselves a story about the nation and about the nation going to the frontier and conquering, and that's the American spirit, right? You go to where there haven't been people or not people who look like you, and you try to conquer that territory and make it civilized. So there's the idea of you go and you make the uncivilized place civilized. And so this also then becomes a really important story in the history of the United States, and not just the history of the United States as looking back at the history of the United States, but the people who are writing the history of the United States. There is, in 1893, a young historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner who is giving a speech about the frontier in American history. And what he's basically doing is he's going to census records, and the census has designated a certain number of people per square mile as basically still like the wilderness or like the frontier. And once you have more people, then you have civilization, or they don't class it as the frontier anymore. And so Turner says like, oh, okay, so last census we've seen there is no more frontier. There's too many people everywhere. So the frontier has closed, and therefore this chapter of American history has closed. And so for Turner, this kind of almost arbitrary decision, right? The Census Bureau decides how many people per square mile means frontier. Like that's, I don't know how they get to that decision, but it's probably not through a very scientific process, right? And then Turner decides that this means that a part of American history is over, and now we can look back at this American history that happened on the frontier, and that it meant that the frontier being a place where people could go and that they could experience, that they can prove themselves at the frontier and then bring a little bit of that back to civilization is the most American thing. And so what Turner is doing here is giving permission to many, many people to write this myth of the American West with kind of historical backing. There's a rhyme and reason to it. Now, of course, he was doing this in a context. He was complaining about other people who had other ideas of why the Americans were so American and what made them American, which we don't need to get into here. But he's talking about he's taking a debate in history and historiography, and what he comes up with becomes the thing that he's known for, and it becomes what so many people think of when they think about the American West and the frontier.
Yeah. Given what we know from having majored in American studies, and I think this is something that always surprises people when they learn about it, is who actually lived in the West. I mean, you kept mentioning the people that lived there, because the image that we get from the media is often just white cowboys, and but it wasn't just that, right? It was a much more diverse society back then.
Yes, it's one of those yes and no questions. Definitely more diverse when it comes to race. Definitely more diverse when it comes to all the different types of people who are there. When it comes to the settlers, the American settlers, it is a relatively male sphere. So it's on the one hand more diverse because people from different races are there. There's indigenous people, and they have various kinds of relationships with the people who are coming in, and they change. There are people who come through Mexico and consider themselves Mexicans, who then become American citizens, U.S. citizens, and have to kind of figure out what that means to them. And when you're a U.S. citizen in New Mexico and Arizona, it doesn't really mean much to you for at least the first couple of years or even couple of decades. And you slowly become kind of enmeshed and immersed into this nation, which is building railroads and telegraphs and is trying to make the very remote place where you are a place that is part of that nation. And then all of a sudden you're part of the constructions of race and of what civilization means and of how you should be living your life of that very, very mainstream white American nation. So the people who live there are, besides the indigenous people, when they come after the 1860s especially, are the kinds of people who are often young, like this idea is being young and male, and a lot of them are people who don't have jobs otherwise and who don't think that they have prospects otherwise. So a lot of cowboys are actually black cowboys. This is one of the things that you talked about, the media and the presentation, the media of the American West, especially the visual media, once it rises in the early 20th century with movies, is very much a racist media in the sense of who the heroes have to be. Yeah. And so they're not typically part of the media depiction, but they are disproportionately represented to a high degree among the cowboys. So if you think about cowboys and you see a group of cowboys, there's definitely going to be black people among them, and it's not kind of the like the John Wayne types solely.
And that happens, like you said, in, for example, Westworld is one movie that I can think of, and then The Harder They Fall, for example. These all have very much diversity in those movies, people of color, and we have women stepping up, which then kind of like clashes with what you were saying about it being a predominantly male.
I mean, it doesn't mean that there are no women there.
Yeah,
right?
no, of course.
So like numbers are one thing, but there are important women in the history of the American West, and the fact that you don't have the backing of a society that can provide all kinds of things, on the other hand, also means you don't really have the strictures and restrictions of that society. So women actually get to do stuff that they wouldn't otherwise. And you can actually see an interesting distinction when you look at two kind of typical Western establishments, which in the media tend to be the one and the same, which is the saloon and then the brothel. And they're not they're not the same, because the saloon is typically run by men, and they would also have sex workers there who would be under the control of the saloon owners, and a lot of brothels would be run by women who would be in charge of it. And well, whatever that means in the American West, it's not a great life for anyone. I'm going to say this is the high time of sexually transmitted diseases. The Civil War created, because it put so many men in close proximity, and any time that they would have sex with a sex worker, sexually transmitted diseases would be transmitted, and they would take them on. And there's a very high percentage of young men in the United States who are just kind of suffering from sexually transmitted diseases without even understanding that's what they are, and then passing them on to. So the whole society is kind of like suffused to that. I'm not saying it's a fun place to be in any way.
Yeah.
That is a detail that we do not get from movies.
Really not.
No.
Which is
You
all
do
the more
get
reason.
disease, right? You get disease,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like a typical disease. You don't you don't often get, that's the late stages of syphilis in a cowboy.
Yeah.
You don't see that very often.
Yeah.
Definitely. So to kind of like take this further into the present with us, why do you think this myth of the Wild West still has such a hold on us today? Because there's still, I mean, all of the movies and media examples that we mentioned have been
contemporary.
Yeah, they're recent examples, right?
And I mean, there's a reason why we chose this as like a podcast episode, obviously, as well, because it has a hold on us and we keep engaging with it in some
we keep reproducing those images as a society. I mean, not us, maybe.
Why?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it has many answers. I think one of them is obviously the very useful nature of the Western myth for American nation building, which comes at a time when the American nation is becoming more important around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Then it is popular culture at a time when movies come into fashion. Some of the very first movies are Western movies, and the whole visual culture around them kind of organizes itself in that way, and it becomes kind of an easy thing to produce as well. And the other thing that then happens is, after World War II, the United States being such a powerful nation and its culture being so powerful on the one hand, this spreads to all kinds of places, either through the culture of other people making their own Western movies, which is a thing that happens especially in the 60s and 70s, and on the other hand, directly exporting these products of American cinema and of American television, which are, however, intrinsically tied to the Cold War and the Western series of the American television networks in the 1950s, 1960s are very much infused with this Cold War ideology. So the United States is also kind of interested in demonstrating who the good guys are and demonstrating what it is like to be, an upright citizen and to fight for the good. So it kind of becomes integrated also into this propaganda story of American culture and the Cold War. And it is very much, it's a good canvas to paint on because you can do a lot and you have a couple of very easy to use story tropes that you can apply and you can make your own. And people start doing that. And every generation or so, there is kind of like a lull in the Western, and then people keep coming back to it because they have a new idea of how to use some of these tropes or how to break them, how to mold them differently.
Yeah. And I think that also kind of bridges the topic over to kind of politics nowadays, because politicians tend to use phrases like frontier spirit or pioneering Americans in their speeches. And thereby they're doing exactly that, channeling this myth, which is intrinsically connected to nation building and painting on that canvas, as you so elegantly put it.
Yeah, you have the idea of the frontier. The word frontier is used again and again. You have a bunch of politicians who specifically kind of styled themselves as Western-style politicians, especially in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan does that, who also is an actor who was in some Western movies. You have George W. Bush, who styles himself as a Westerner, wearing the big cowboy hat and clearing brush in his ranch when he's not presidenting. But you have this idea of the frontier, of like the next place you need to go as something that we should be doing as Americans or as humanity, is very powerful. And it is very much tied to the story of progress, right? Progress is always the next thing. We need to improve. We need to do more. And when you see this in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy picks this up for his idea of how to restructure society. But on the other hand, also in the space race, this becomes a thing that people use, right? The space is considered to be similar to the Wild West. And there, then in the culture, you find a lot of likenings, not just Star Trek, but sometimes also outright kind of Western space type things. And it's very telling that you have these storylines of frontier. They're something that Americans really kind of can't get away from. If you think about the internet in the 1990s is often called, the next frontier or the digital frontier. There's an organization dedicated to a certain type of internet advocacy, free speech, and all that, and open software, calling itself the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and they're directly playing into this myth of the frontier of the West as like, this is something we should be doing as Americans. We need to be aware of the new frontiers. And so if you think about progress and if you think about the good things that America wants to do in kind of like that propagandistic way, then the frontier is always something that they're going to use because it is so easily and readily available.
Yeah. So I guess to boil this down a little bit, we've learned that the Wild West, or quote unquote the West, was never as wild maybe or as white as we've been told through the media, but it's mainly just important, I think, to keep in mind that it's not the same as history, right?
Yeah, and the myth was as much about like progress, nation building, as it was about entertainment. And it still shapes very much how we think about politics and cultures today.
Yeah. And I mean, if there's one takeaway, not only for us, but for our listeners, I think it's that the stories we tell about history matter. This sounds really like almost oversimplified, but I think it's true.
That's what it comes down to, right?
I mean, they shape our values, how we think about the world, our policies, our identities, even today.
Absolutely.
Right? So
yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself as a historian. I think every story you tell about history matters, and I think it really matters how you frame it, and maybe that you put a highlight on something that somebody else hasn't looked at or hasn't looked at in the same way, or have a fresh perspective on it. And you can do that with the American West. This is another whole part of American West history and historiography that we didn't really talk about. Historians of the American West have done this multiple times to reframe the stories that they're telling away from the national story of progress and the story of conquest to a story in which people related to each other in the West, and these different types of people and what they did. And it's really about, in the end, it's all about people and their way of relating to each other, and whether this happens in the medium of the myth or it happens in actual reality. As a historian, you kind of have to strike a balance between telling a story, but then making sure that the story is actually true. But the framing obviously matters to the story, where you started, where you ended, and who's part of it and who isn't.
Yeah.
And now, in light of our little summary that we just gave, and thinking of all the research that you've previously done surrounding the quote-unquote Wild West, is there anything in particular that you would like the people listening to this to know about or take away from this that you haven't mentioned?
I think what is important to understand when you look at something that has become this big and this mythical is how small and human and petty it can be when you go to the sources and when you learn about the specific people who are doing specific things, how they lived their lives and what they had to deal with and how they saw themselves. It really becomes hundreds and thousands of individual stories, and they kind of form together into this big idea of the American West. But maybe that's not the most interesting story. Maybe the most interesting story is the one story that you find, that you dig down deep on, and then come up with something new that happens within that place, within that space.
I love that. Thank you. And now, before we wrap this up, as you listeners might know, if you've tuned in to this show before, we always have one last personal-ish question for our guest.
And this time we decided to make it a little more topical because we'd like to know how has researching the West or the Wild West changed the way you personally see American history or American identity, perhaps?
I think if you look at the West and you look at the idea of the Wild West or the Old West or kind of the mythical idea, once you go very deep on that, once you study that for a long time, what you kind of are left with is a thought that's not so much related to specifically the West itself, but to anything that we tell ourselves as history, how much of that is based in the stories that someone else has told you. So my big takeaway is always to try and dig just one level deeper and try to figure out if the story that I have been told and that I have believed until now is actually a story that's backed by the facts, or if we just all kind of liked the myth more and that's why we've run with it.
And I think that level of critical thinking is something truly beautiful about our
That's exactly what I just thought. Yeah.
We have one brain cell and I had it for a second. Over to you.
I think that beautifully exemplifies what American Studies does also, is just this process of, and bringing it to I don't know, a bigger level almost, and zooming out onto the big picture and being able to make connections in other fields and just generally how you look at things.
While at the same time zooming in and really digging deep and get your claws in there.
Touchdown. Nice.
Right.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kathke, for joining us. It has been so much fun and very insightful just talking about all of this with you.
And thank you, as always, to our listeners for tuning in. And as always, if you out there have any insights to share, perhaps a narrative that manages to debunk this myth of other than the narratives we just mentioned, because I think all of them are pretty generic, and just reproduce these images. But if you, like I said, if you know any narratives that treat that myth differently, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, and follow us on Instagram to never miss an update about this podcast and get little teaser trailers while you impatiently wait for the next episode, just bound to your chair. I know that you are.
Everyone's seated and ready. I just know it. Right.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Make It Make Sense is the official podcast of the Obama Institute for Transnational American Studies at JGU Mainz, Germany. This podcast is hosted by Marlene Winkler and Paulina Schlosser and edited by Paulina Schlosser. We're recording at the sound studios of the Zentrum für Audiovisuelle Produktion at JGU.
For more information on us, check out our website and don't forget to always keep up with us on Instagram at Obama Institute. Thank you for listening.